Alrighty, welcome in everybody, welcome in. It is 2 p.m., so we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome everybody to Okie 11's webinar on the consequences of reporting false emergencies. Today, we're going to talk about a variety of things. I'll go ahead and introduce myself. I'm William Bohannon. I'm an Education and Outreach Liaison with Okie 11. And what we're going to talk about are a variety of things that come around those false emergencies that can happen and kind of what constitutes those. We'll explain more of what qualifies as a true emergency. We'll highlight some common misuse scenarios, outline the impacts that has on facility operators and locators, and then we'll learn how to go through that emergency process more effectively and efficiently if you are responding to an emergency. So let's jump right on in with our overview. So here are the key things that we're going to be looking into today. We're going to discuss more about the definition, what really constitutes an emergency locate, and what elements kind of drive into that. We'll look at some great examples that play along with that as well. We'll discuss more about that common misuse, how false emergencies happen. They often occur due to a lot of misunderstandings or miscommunications, and when those reports aren't fully understood for what they're intended for. We'll talk about the impacts of that misuse, what that has an impact on for the locators, for the operators, and even excavators when an emergency locate request is misused. Of course, the key thing of our webinar are the consequences of that misuse. What can happen if an emergency locate is considered unjustified? And one of the best things that we like to provide are those best practices and resources that Okie 811 does have for helping to prevent that misuse, for guiding into the right direction when it comes to determining which locate request you're needing. So, of course, we need to talk about Okie 811's role in all of this. As the notification center, what role do we play that distinguishes, right? So we are Oklahoma's statewide notification service. We connect the excavators with the operators, right? So we're dedicated to damage prevention to those underground facilities. We want to provide quality services for that damage prevention. Again, we're that communication hub. And as a communication hub, our big thing is to take the information, document it, and send it to those parties that need it. We offer training and resources every day. That's what our big thing is here in the Education and Outreach Department, is to provide as much resources for Oklahomans as possible when it comes to safe excavation. If you ever have any questions or want to discuss anything further, or you just like some more information, you can always reach out to us at education@okie811.org. We do want you to know, though, we don't own, operate, mark, or locate any lines. Again, we just communicate. So, talked about Okie, but what about the operators? Operators play a critical role in this as well. They maintain and update their utility maps. This is a key responsibility of theirs, as well as responding promptly to locate requests. Providing those timely responses, those can significantly reduce the risk of accidents and ensure smoother operations. They must stay reachable for questions and concerns if something were to happen. They dispatch locators either from their organization or through a contract, and respond to utility emergencies and damages. So their operations priority is for their utilities underground. So what about the locator's role? We've got to get all the pieces into place with Oki, operators, locators, and excavators. What are all these roles playing a part in when it comes to the ticketing system, and especially with emergencies? So looking at locators and their role, they also have a very important role with that safety integrity of underground utilities. Of course, they must locate and mark the approximate area of those underground utilities. It's vital for preventing any of those damages and very important for that information and communication of those markings to be interpreted, right? So communicate that through the positive response systems. If the area has been marked, partially marked, if there was no access, sometimes they'll leave contact information to stay reachable, and that is an important best practice to stay reachable if there are any questions, concerns, comments, those kinds of things. And this is all, again, kind of playing a part and together because we're all connected through this process. And so our communication needs to be streamlined. And excavators, your role is also incredibly important for ensuring that safe and efficient practice and damage prevention altogether. So some big things for excavators, especially. Got to plan effectively for those excavation projects. Document, document, document. Try to make timelines, visuals, take pictures of the site before, during, and after the process. This helps keep a pretty concise observation of what's going on throughout the project. If something happens or changes, having that information can be very pivotal. Of course, the excavator's responsibility is to request locates whenever necessary for a project. Anytime you're breaking ground, moving dirt, it is important to have your locate request. It is also important to confirm all positive responses, that everything's been marked, everything looks good, and that your markings and positive response look the same. Of course, respecting the tolerance zone, that's 24 inches either side, all directions of an underground utility. Those markings give you the general area, and within that area, you need to be using soft digging and hand digging practices, no mechanized equipment in the area. It is also an excavator's responsibility to report damages if they are ever observed or occur during a project. And we'll get more into that just here in just a little bit. But let's specifically look at what defines an emergency ticket. So when dealing with emergency tickets, it is important to understand the urgency and responsibility involved, right? This is an immediate threat to life, health, or property. If you're the one responding in that situation to fix the line, you're the one submitting the emergency locate. And sometimes that can be misunderstood for the damage report. Damage report is if something happens to the line. But if you are responding to a damage to a line, or if there's another emergency, like in this image, you can see the tree, that quantifies the need for an emergency locate. Now, with an emergency locate, when you submit your emergency ticket, this can allow for immediate excavation. Now, OK811 will ask for clarification on what timeline you're trying to work in, but if there's an immediate threat that needs to be addressed, you do have the right to immediately begin excavation. Of course, a best practice is to always give as much time as possible for locators to arrive. If you're requesting an emergency request, clearly explain what that emergency is. What is going on? What happened? Has a tree fallen after a storm? Is there a line that's burst? Those kinds of things. describe what's going on, what's the location, what is this affecting. Those items are very important, not only for the excavator's documentation, but also for that emergency locate. And of course, provide as much notice as possible. If you can give a few hours, try to give a few hours. If you must start immediately, you may begin to do so. Either way, you must dig with as much caution as possible, as you may not know what other lines are within that vicinity. So, as we continue, let's look at that kind of request breakdown. What do those parts look like as the process moves through? So let's say an emergency's occurred, and the first thing that's going to happen is whoever is going to address that emergency communicates with Oki 811 and says, we need to open emergency, locate request, this is what's happening, here's all the information, location, what we're going to be doing, what all is happening in the environment, are there any other potential hazards that could be occurring? And then Oki, we take that information and we distribute it to the operators in that area of work being done. The operators are then alerted of that emergency locate request, and they dispatch their locators. That information streamlines through. We collect as much as we can, package it with what the excavator has given us. So as much information and as accurate information as possible is important for getting that package moved over to the operators, and then the operators moving it over to the locators. And the locators will try to work within that time frame to get the area marked if there's a time frame allotted. And if there's a delay, that locator will coordinate with the excavator. There's going to be communication that arrives from this. The utilities will then be marked as a typical locate request. But this is where that accurate information really, really helps out, because the more accuracy there is, the better the response is going to be. Of course, accurate notice, accurate information, getting that emergency response, right? We understand that everyone is committed to acting immediately upon receiving any of these emergency notices. So there's no minimum notice required, but it is important to provide as much time as possible. Oki 811 will ask for that work start time and details of the emergency. So stick with what you provide. If you say, I can do this in 6 hours, we can shut off maybe the water main, and we can give it a little bit of time for this marking to come through. It depends on the situation, right? There's a lot of different evaluations that go around that. And one of the reasons why I would personally argue why an emergency action plan is necessary for any kind of damages like that going forward, just so every team has a plan. Provide true and accurate time that the work will begin and as many details as possible. Inaccurate information causes delays, potential hazards. It can even cause frustration between operators, locators, excavators. And so we want to make sure that as much information that is accurate and complete as possible comes through. Again, as much time as possible. So we've gone through a good amount of those definitions and kind of how the system plays out and that progress throughout the system and process. So we'll look at a couple of examples of emergencies, potential emergencies, and non-emergencies, and give a pretty quick breakdown of what each example represents and how that response may look. So in our first example, it's going to be storm damage. Maybe a storm came through overnight because it's Oklahoma weather, right? It changes sometimes every 5 minutes, sometimes every 2 weeks. So it could happen, right? There's a report of tree damage threatening a gas line in an easement and power lines above. So if you're tasked to respond, there are some things that you got to keep in mind. Is there damage to that underground utility? Are there damages to the above power lines? Is there a threat to life, health, or property? Well, if those lines are jeopardized, and quite frankly, if there are power lines above and a gas line below, that could be a culmination for a disaster, right? So most likely there is. And if there isn't any damage to report already, let's begin there. Analyze the area. Make sure that you're getting full and complete information before jumping in and starting to address something. The report should notify the gas company, any endangered lines underground, any of those operators there, and should be communicated not only through the 811 system, but also to those utility operators. And if you are tasked with removing that tree, of course, submit that emergency ticket. If you have to do the work to address this, make sure that you have all that documentation, all that evidence of what's going on, and create that timeline. So let's look at a second example here. Let's say you're on a rural water crew and a landscaping crew was planting a tree and struck the line. You are tasked with repairing that line. For our side of the process, again, start by gathering as much information as possible. Get all the information of what's going on around. Is it just this portion of the line? Are there other fractures in the line due to it? What all's going on? Provide as much information as possible and create that emergency ticket if you are responding to that repair. If you can provide some time, as much time as possible, if work must begin immediately, use caution and communicate that. Say, this needs to be done right now. We do not have the infrastructure to stop the water for X amount of time for it to be located. We need to have these things caught up. And of course, a third emergency we want to talk about. We'll continue to use our imaginations here, and we can imagine maybe we're working on a crew with fiber. Maybe we're on a fiber crew, and there's a notification that a car accident cut off a communication line to a hospital or the fire department. And this event requires an immediate response. We would need to submit an emergency ticket and provide that time that we could to address the damages. If that can be negotiated and communicated, communication is one of the biggest things that's going to maintain safety, right? Communicating, caution, not rushing, making sure that you have full and complete accurate information. There's a lot that goes into it, right? So all in all, we're looking at a series of steps. Are we addressing the emergency? How much time and information can we provide? Are we going to be able to safely excavate to address the emergency? Are we going to need to pivot and use other methods? There's a lot to consider when addressing an emergency. One of the big things that we do want to focus on is if you have to excavate for an emergency, creating that emergency locate request, trying to provide as much time as possible for addressing that emergency, communicating effectively, and not rushing. Some of my experience in the past, I did law enforcement at a VOTEC and learned a whole bunch of things. But one of the big things that we communicated about was don't create an emergency responding to an emergency. Rushing is one of the easiest ways to cause a new emergency. So taking time, taking a breath, analyzing, getting all the facts, putting it all together and having a timeline is going to be very important for maintaining safety throughout that. So let's look at some potential emergencies, right? These will be, we'll pick up the pace a little bit, but these could be considered potential emergencies, which is interesting. It's all about situation, right? So let's look at this. In Oklahoma, we're a big ranching state. So let's consider a rancher's fence has collapsed after a washout. The cattle are out in the road, and this could be an emergency. The cattle could be disrupting traffic flow. It could be causing accidents or other events that could kind of cascade into those threats to life, health, or property. So there are some things that could be considered that could avoid this being a potential emergency. Could the cattle be moved to another pasture until that fence is fixed? Are there other things that could minimize that risk to it becoming an emergency and compromises that could be made to remove that risk? What about a golf course and its irrigation system froze and burst? Well, if the water could be shut off and it could be fixed at a later date, wouldn't necessarily be an emergency. However, what if that water was pouring into the street at below freezing temperatures and there isn't a way to shut off that water immediately? It may create an emergency. Maybe there's a tree in the yard and its roots are pushing into the house's foundation. There isn't damage at the time. Could you plan for that removal? Is it or is it not a threat to that property or health? These are things to really consider, and our agents will ask clarifying questions to make sure that everything is falling into the correct ticket type, so there are appropriate responses. It's balance for everybody. Balance. So understanding that if there are opportunities to mitigate that risk or compromise, it's important to do so so it's not disturbing the infrastructure of resources. So here's some great examples of non-emergencies and what constitutes some of those non-emergencies, right? So number one is an excavator's timeline. If the timeline is tightening, this is not an emergency. We understand that things happen, projects have delays, you have to adapt sometimes. We highly suggest one of the big things, which is excavator's responsibility to plan thoroughly through a project and plan for those potential delays and conflicts before those projects start. Planning can help prevent additional frustrations and false emergencies. Being able to provide a little bit of buffer time for different kinds of discrepancies that come up can be a huge, huge help for those projects. Another example is forgetting to submit a locate request before that project begins. Let's say a landscaping company gets a call to do some work that day, and it would involve implanting a garden, trees, moving rocks, pulling items out of the ground, putting new things into the ground. This opportunity for work is not an emergency. Again, it's all about planning accordingly. Something like this is a safety boundary. So using stop work authority, saying, hey, pause, time out, we want to make sure that we get the area located before we start to do all this work. We can't just jump into it today. We want to be safe. We want to make sure that everybody is protected throughout this process. So having that communication again and setting everybody up for success with planning is very important for an excavator. Example number 3, exposed lines that are not an emergency. They may be a tripping hazard, so be avoidant. If you can, close off an area if a line is exposed. But if you find an exposed line, and a big one that we talk about are a variety of lines, including fiber, any kinds of residential lines that could be exposed due to weathering, erosion, those kinds of things. There's another process for this. If you find an exposed line, submit a damage report to Okie 811. An exposed line falls under damages as it needs to be concealed. And it's when you send in that report, it's documented and communicated with those facility operators that may have that line in the area. Try to give space for that line, of course. Don't try to bury it yourself or anything like that. Allow the utility operators to manage their lines and for them to plan accordingly to manage those lines. So why is emergency misuse a concern overall? It puts a strain on resources. This is a significant concern for multiple reasons, right? This is affecting locator time, equipment, marking materials, operators and their staff, equipment and materials. This causes delays to true emergencies and other projects that have their tickets in. This removes resources from one area and puts them in another. A huge thing that we also need to communicate here is that this erodes the system's integrity, right? This is in place to protect people's life, health, property, right? True emergencies that could have life-altering effects overall. And so false emergencies are being sent in, and those are being addressed while something else is occurring that needs to be addressed. This starts to remove the validity of a true emergency. And of course, for excavators, this can also have financial and legal repercussions. Each ticket has a cost for operators. Excavators can use the ticketing system for free. However, this comes at a cost for the operators. And in Oklahoma's law, they may recover those costs if those requests were excessive or unnecessary. So emergency misuse is a genuine concern. When we're talking about that impact on the locators, they're going to start feeling rushed, stressed, have longer hours, and this can create safety concerns with driving from place to place, adapting to new areas that need those marks. So this affects their well-being and can delay responses to true emergencies and other events. Of course, this also affects operators because it disrupts operations, creating overtime costs, travel issues. A variety of new things come into the logistics, and unexpected travel comes up. There could be ripple effects that come from this, right? So true emergencies are reserved for these tickets. Now, of course, excavators may be faced with delays, new hazards, frustrated locators, operators. It may also cause being faced with repaying those costs if not a true emergency. And I'll jump into a finer definition of what the repaying those costs look like here. So on the legal and financial side, in the OUFDPA, the Oklahoma Underground Facilities Damage Prevention Act, this is in Oklahoma State Statutes, Public Health and Safety, Title 63, subsection 142.7. Operators may recover costs for excessive or unreasonable locate requests. So if there is a false emergency, they have the right for an unreasonable locate request to recover costs. Because this directly impacts the operators and financial aspects of handling the emergency tickets, right? So misuse, repeated misuse of those emergency tickets. In a true emergency, clear documentation, having a timeline, having photographs, having that ticket number, keeping all of that compiled and saying, I had an emergency response. Here's my packet of information, my timeline before, during, and after of the steps that we took. Very important for an excavator to clarify that it is their response and how they've managed it. And when taking those photos, I'll clarify a little bit here. When taking those photos, get photos up close if you can of what is occurring. Try to get full sight images from longer distances and kind of create staging of how those images represent the whole operation or project that needs to be addressed. So let's scoot on over to some best practices and resources that we have for making those emergency responses pretty clear and concise, and how to avoid the misuse of emergencies. So some best practices for excavators and operators. We have some key strategies here that can really help out. So for excavators, of course, plan ahead, plan efficiently. If you have the time that you can provide for those locators to come in and get that area marked, try to provide that time. If you can hold off on the line, or if you can hold off on the fence repair, whatever it may be, that requires digging, excavation, try to provide that time. Document everything. Document, document, document. Write it out. Take pictures. Take screenshots of communication logs, the ticket information. Try to keep all of that together, so if there's ever any kind of question about what's going on, if there was ever any kind of ramification coming back, you have all of that information prepared, and it says, hey, this was a true emergency. I did do X, Y, and Z, and here is all the evidence for that. Of course, inform any crew members that you may be working with about what qualifies for that emergency, what aspects of the emergency response are falling into that. Review tickets before submitting. Make sure, again, full, complete, accurate information, because this affects that response coming out. And remember, a delay in work is not an emergency. For operators and locators, track and document misuse trends. Provide feedback and information to those repeat offenders. Try to do some coaching, guidance, describe those differences of this may have constituted for a normal locate request where you put in an emergency. Communicate those expectations clearly and with crews. And of course, OKA 11 is happy to help and provide further resources for any crews that may benefit from that guidance or training for what constitutes an emergency versus a normal compliant ticket. Now, with OKA 11 itself, we have a variety of digital resources for everyone in excavation. Over at our website, oka11.org, we have our Learning Hub, which has a variety of things. We have our A11 certification training virtually and in person by request. There are also checklist PDFs under the Excavator tab on our website. We have the Excavator portal for submitting those tickets, reviewing your tickets, checking your positive response in real time. We have a chatbot that can help answer questions that may be quick, or if you have more in-depth questions, you can always reach out to the Education Outreach team. We have webinars just like this, a full schedule booked out throughout the year. We have our safety days, expo registration. Our expo next year will be coming up in September of 2027. We also have safety days all throughout the state. Our next safety day will be in Tulsa, August 12th. On our website, we have our excavator guides with the law and for references, best practices, those kinds of items. You can also request physical resources from the education outreach team. We ourselves are a resource. We're here for everybody in Oklahoma as a damage prevention resource. We want to be able to have conversations with everybody and make sure that we are all on the same page and all have the same information. We do want to share that our resources do come in English and Spanish, and that's a pretty big deal throughout the state. So our resources are for every Oklahoman. Now, as we begin to wrap up, we'll open up if there are a couple of questions just for maybe 2 to 3 minutes. Locates are only good for a certain amount of time. You don't need new locate. You just need to click in. Right. Joshua Anderson, that is a fantastic point that you bring up here. And when you are updating a ticket, it's important to know that we have updated a part of our process, and tickets, if you're updating, must be updated no less than 4 business days. So if you have 4 business days before the expiration of your ticket and you know that you're going to go beyond that lifespan of that ticket, you need to update no less than 4 business days. Thank you for joining us. Okay, perfect. Well, with that, we'll start to do some wrap up here. So thank you all for joining us today with our webinar. As we take a moment to set up the raffle for our Amazon gift card, we'd love to know your feedback for more training opportunities. If there's anything that we may have missed that you would like more information on, you're more than welcome to scan this QR code, or I can drop a link, or maybe Luis can drop a link in the chat for this feedback. This feedback gives us an opportunity to learn more of what perspectives, excavators, locators, operators, anybody in the industry who's looking for more information, for us to tailor new information for you. So we would love to hear your feedback. Of course, completing this feedback form provides a raffle opportunity for an Amazon gift card at the end of the month. So thank you all again so much for joining us for today's webinar. If there's anything that you would like to reach out about regarding today's webinar or anything in the future, please feel free to contact us at education@okie811.org. And outside of that, we hope that you continue to dig smart and dig safe. And we hope that you have a wonderful rest of your week.